Friday, everybody. Just looking forward to the weekend. Is a little bit less sweet knowing that you've got an exam waiting on the other side of the weekend. I don't do it intentionally for the exam on Mondays. I prefer having an exam on Wednesdays, to be honest. Those like the sweet spot. This is the way the schedule worked out, so this is where the exam falls. So exam number 2 coming up. Real quick, I'm going to pause the recording here because I forgot to mention the video talk. So I did want to mention one thing. So if people are watching the recording, you're not missing anything. I just want to put some information up that I don't want to YouTube to help me for cyberbullying. All right, back to the recording, and none the worse for wear. All right, so we've got the exam coming up on Monday, so I want to give you some preliminary information. One of the questions that's always asked is the breakdown of what the content's going to be. Effectively speaking, we are going to have 3 questions for everything that we covered, 3 multiple choice questions for everything that was covered. So that's 5 chapters, chapters 10, 11, 12, 13, and 14. And then we're going to have 3 questions over Excel and 3 questions over NetSuite. Now that does not equal 20, so you may say that can't be correct. And the answer is chapter 11, I'm only doing 2 multiple choice questions because that was the one that was more practical in application. But generally speaking, 3 questions over everything that we've covered. The one problem, there's going to be one problem on the exam. It has 6 parts and it covers the chapter's content pretty much. There's a little bit of overlap with some of the things we talked about with Excel, but for the most part, it's going to be the chapters 10 through 14 content that will come to that. So it's all parts. Real quick note on this study guide. I think I said this in the previous study guide, but I want to clarify on this. So I use some terminology in the study guide. I use the terms identify and define. In some situations, I said identify. Some situations, I said define. Some situations, I said both. If I said identification, that would be if I give you a term, you should be able to identify, or if I give you a description, you should be able to understand what term I'm referring to in that situation. Define is if I give you the term, you need to provide me with the description. Okay. If I said both, then you need to be able to do both of those. So identification is a little bit less stringent than definition, but for the most part, just keep that in mind as you're moving forward. If I just say identify something, then my expectations on that are going to be a little bit less than definition. Definition means you need to know it really pretty well. Okay. As we go through the study guide, as always, I'm going to go through some of the things that I think are important. I am not going to cover every single little detail of the study guide, nor will I cover everything that's going to go in the exam. I write out the study guide in detail for a reason, so you can study it on your own. But some of the things I'm going to talk about, I think I need provide clarification on. So if there's something I do not cover in the study guide and you need some additional clarification on, please raise your hand and let me know what the issue is, and I will talk about it to the best of my ability. So in the study guide, chapter 10, I think is one of the more important chapters because it talks about the nature of data analytics. All the stuff up here is really important. Particularly when we start talking about the AMPS model, you do need to know all the parts of the AMPS model, and you need to know the components individually pretty well. All right. So this is not just saying, do I know the names of the 4 components? That's the starting point. I would expect everybody in the room to know that. But there are going to be questions about the individual components of the AMPS model. Some specific items that are going to be relevant import. The 4 types of data questions that are under master the data. That's actually detailed in slides, chapter 10 slides, slide number 12. So please make sure you're familiar with this. Again, you need to be able to know what the 4 types are and have a general understanding of what each of these different data questions relate to. And then right below that, there's a bullet point right below that says, what are audit data standards? The only reason I bring this up is I've asked questions about this in past semesters, and for some reason this gets blown out of proportion. It's not meant to be difficult, but these are data standards that dictate the data requirements for external auditors. And so external auditors, keep in mind, those are the individuals that come in that are trying to test the financial reporting financial reporting parameters of the organization. They have very specific requirements. Audit data standards specify the requirements that are being detailed in that particular setting. And every time I ask a question about this, if there's been a level of confusion, it's not meant to be confusing, but please make sure you take a look at the audit data standards and you look at that definition. It's not much more convoluted than that. It's actually pretty straightforward, but for some reason this creates confusion. I don't know why. With respect to perform the analysis, what are the 4 types of analysis and stuff? This is probably one of the most important questions in this entire chapter. This will actually hit multiple points as it did in the practice exam. So remember, there are 4 types of analysis. There's the descriptive analysis, what happened. There's the diagnostic analysis, why did it happen? There's the predictive analysis, what will happen, and there's prescriptive analysis, what should we do based on what we think will happen. We talked about that in multiple different contexts, so you can expect that there will be questions on the exam about this, so please make sure you're familiar with this. Again, these are not complicated questions, but for some reason, a lot of people just kind of overlook this. I will tell you 100% certainty that there will be questions on this on the exam, so we're on the practice exam. All right. Chapter 11, key types of visualization. This gets overlooked quite a bit, but in the visualization, I will expect you to know with respect to the different types of visualization, what type of analysis do you perform? So you'll need to know not only what data applies to the visualization, but what visualization applies to the data. So if I say, okay, what would be the data that I would test using horizontal or vertical bar charts? You should be able to note that that's categorical data. If I say what type of data would I use, or what type of data would I use map or spatial charts to visualize, you should be able to say use spatial data. On the other direction, if I say, all right, what type of chart would I use to show analysis of time chains of trends of data? You'd say line chart. So be able to know all of those in all those directions. I know that's kind of nitpicky, but I do think this is important to note. So that's something I want you to take a look at and make sure you have familiarity with. All right. The views in Power BI, I wanted to make a note of this. So on the practice exam, there was a question about this. I used the old terminology, and I only realized that today. I was going to make an update about that, but my computer is currently being worked on in my office, so I'm having trouble getting any updates set up. If there is a question on the views in Power BI, I will use the ones that we talked about in class, okay? And that's specifically report, table, and model. The one that's in the practice exam, I apologize. I thought I'd updated it, and apparently I meant to update it, and I never got around to it. So I sincerely apologize for that. But if it's on the exam, we'll be using the new terminology, but not the okay, I will promise you that. So make sure you know the difference between report, table, and model. Remember, report is our visualization tab where we actually perform the visualizations. Tables where we can dissect the data. We can look at it in table view, and we can actually add information to it. And then the model view, that's actually where we define the relationships. It's also used to control the relationship. So we can actually determine what the primary keys and foreign keys are and how those how the different tables relate to one another. So please make sure you have some familiarity with that. Also, moving on to chapter 14, Bitcoin, a peer-to-peer electronic cash system. So what were the primary goals? Make sure you take a look at this slide right here. There's a lot going on in this slide, but I would expect you to be familiar with all of it because all of it's very relevant with respect to how blockchain originated and what the goals of it were. So yeah, please be familiar with that. That was chapter 12, slide number 2, by the way, just in case you were taking notes. What are the different types of four types of blockchain systems? The book only talks about 3. You do need to know all 4. So remember, public, private, consortium, and hybrid. Those are the 4 types of blockchain systems. Please make sure you're familiar with those and provide basic definitions. We're not going to go into a lot of detail, but I would expect you to understand the basic difference between those. Machine learning, I would definitely spend some time looking at the content that was related down to machine learning. All of this, I think, is very relevant, so please make sure you take a look at it. Some specific items that I think you should need to be very familiar with. The different types of tasks, the 2 types of tasks that machine learning systems are designed to perform. You need to be able to identify them and define them, which means that you need to know not only, I'll give you the term, what am I talking about, or the definition of what I'm talking about. You need to be able to actually take it from a term and provide a clarification for that. So that's classification and regression, okay? There's actually a practice exam question where we'll define those here in just a little bit, so I'm not going to go into detail on those, but make sure you're familiar with those. And the 4 types of machine learning, that's a really important one, probably the most important out of all of these. So 4 types of machine learning. We have supervised machine learning, unsupervised, semi-supervised, and reinforcement. What's the difference? Supervised learning is that we have known input and known output, okay? Some unsupervised, we have known input but unknown output. Semi-supervised, remember, that's where we have gaps in the data that the computer itself or the machine itself has to figure out what the gaps in the data are and be able to extrapolate based on that. And reinforcement learning is trial and error. And I will talk about certain scenarios. There is overlap in these, but I will give you very specific language if I'm describing a certain scenario that you should be able to determine. It will be based on the language that I just talked about, okay? So make sure you have definitions and understand the 4 types of those. because that's a very likely question on the exam. All right, 3 general categories of internal controls, preventive, detective, corrective. Please make sure you can define each of those categories, determine how they're used, and provide examples of each. This is obviously very important because I'm big on control, so make sure you can identify those. In that regard, those are general internal control categories. We're talking about categories of IT controls. Those are going to be our general and access control, or access controls and application controls. The definitions have not changed from what we talked about back in the previous exam, so make sure you just look back on that. Remember, general and access controls define how employees or users of the system, what they can do within the system, and then application controls define what the system itself does, how it tracks activity within the system. 2 primary organizational governance frameworks. We're going to talk about that very briefly. That's COSO, the COSO Internal Control Integrated Framework, and the ERM framework. Honestly, we will talk about the Internal Control Integrated Framework in detail in just a second. The ERM framework, you don't need to know that much about, other than it looks very similar to the COSO Internal Control Integrated Framework. You won't need to know the 5 components of the ERM framework. I'm not going to ask about that. All you really need to know is that the ERM framework is one of the 2 frameworks. It has a different scope. Remember, internal control is more about risk, whereas ERM is more about organizational objectives. The 3 types of IT governance frameworks and the broad objectives each. So we had COBIT, ITIL, and ISO 27000 series. So make sure, I think there's another question on that. There's a question on that in the practice exam, which we'll talk about those at length. You need to know their names and you need to know their broad objectives. So be able to explain what each of those do at a very, basically you understand the difference between them. All right, I've said this already, I will say it again. COSO Internal Control Integrated Framework, 100% chance there will be a question on this. Know this very, very well, okay? One of my favorite things to talk about. Aside from that, it's really important to everyone, okay? This is content that expands beyond this course, so I expect you to know beyond this course, so I'm definitely going to test you on it. So what are the 3 objectives of COSO? Make sure you know those 3 objectives and can state the difference. So basically speaking, they're going to be reliability, financial reporting, achievement of objectives, and compliance with laws and regulations. Reporting operations and compliance. Kind of stumbled there, I apologize. 5 components of COSO. We talked about this at length. I walked through them there. You need to know these really, really well. When I say know, and not just their names, but be able to actually provide definitions of each, okay? Control environment, that's the tone at top of the organization that dictates the pace of controls. Entities risk assessment, that's the process of identifying risks that the organization is subject to. Control activities, that's actual controls themselves being implemented in the organization. Information communication, that's communication of responsibilities and controls, both for internal and external stakeholders. And then monitoring, that's updating systems as risks change to make sure that we have appropriate controls in current scenarios. I know I went through that quickly, but I've gone through that multiple times. You do need to know all 5 parts and all 5 definitions. So yeah, be able to identify, define, and explain the purpose of all 5 components, just like I did. This last one, this one's a little bit of an outdated note. So this one right here, I will not ask you a question on, because the way the ERM used to work, it was basically the COSO framework. It was just additional objectives and components. But like I said in class, that actually is no longer the case. Now that we have a new ERM framework that's unique and on its own. So you can actually just toss this out of the study guide. You can scratch this out. I won't ask a question about this. Okay. Chapter 14, what is the CIA triad? Confidentiality, integrity, and availability. All 3 aspects have to be in place for information to be secure. Okay, information has to be kept confidential, has to be integrity information, has to be made available. If any of those fail, then information security is lapsed. What are some examples of external threats or cyber attacks that information systems face? We had a bunch of them. Some that you probably should keep an eye on because we talked about them in depth in class. We talked about social engineering, data breaches, and ransomware. So make sure you have some familiarity with those. Also, shortage of cybersecurity personnel. I talked a little bit about that. That's not a cyber attack, but that is definitely a threat that's faced by many organizations. Spectacles, encrypted authentication. I got that right. So in the past, I've used that. I said that incorrectly, but that's correct. Symmetric key versus asymmetric key encryption. All right, so all you really need to know is contained within the slides in chapters 14, slides 10 and 11. Make sure you understand the definitions of each, and make sure you can differentiate between the diagrams. I in all likelihood, I will utilize analogies in here. So remember, this is the padlock analogy. This is the ATM card analogy, and why those analogies are appropriate to make sure you can explain that. Okay, so make sure you take a look at that. While we're at it, I would spend some time looking also on slide number 12. So that's chapter 14, slides 10, 11, and 12. These are kind of the combination of use of encryption authentication. Make sure you know the definition of hashing and what the purpose of hashing is. Also, have at least a passing understanding of digital signatures. I won't expect you to have an expert level understanding, mostly because I don't have an expert level understanding, but you should at least have some familiarity with what they represent. Okay. Components of the fraud triangle. Remember, those are the three aspects of fraud that have to be present in order for fraud to occur. That's incentive or pressure, opportunity, and attitude or rationalization. We went through that in homework, so I'm not going to go too much more in depth than what we talked about in the homework. But you were responsible for identifying all of those and, if necessary, providing scenarios. Also, I guess should probably go back to check 40 slides. Examples of preventive controls related to system availability and corrective controls related to system availability. All I'm going to tell you on this one is go to this next to last slide, which is slide number 20. Make sure you know these, okay? Make sure you know what these are. So know the names of them and what they each represent and whether they're preventive or corrective controls. I say preventive and I use preventative. I'm not consistent in my usage, my apologies, but same thing, preventative or preventative. Yeah, so make sure you have familiarity with all those. All right, so that for the Excel in-class activities, I want to reiterate my points on the Excel in-class activities. Also, okay, so first of all, the predictive analytic in Excel, I forgot to update this for this particular semester. Remember, we talked about this, that we could not actually install the data analysis tool pack to create a histogram. So I won't ask you questions about how to create a histogram. Basically, all we did in that is we did a group by pivot table, which we've already done before, so you don't need to know anything there. So there's probably not going to be a question on this. What there will be questions on, and I want to reiterate because I said this in the last exam, if I gave you a formula or a function and we worked this out in class, we actually went through the formula or function in class, I would expect you to know the components of that formula or function, okay? There will 100% be at least one question, if not multiple questions in this area, okay? One, I can tell you where there will be 100% chance of a question about the formula or function or nature of is going to be this right here, the index match function and index and match functions and the use of those together, okay? We spent quite a bit of time working through those and looking at examples. I will not ask you index match, okay? Remember that was the fun one we did at the end where we actually did both vertical and horizontal analysis, but I would expect you to be able to do index match by itself. So you might want to reflect upon that and look for that again. 100% chance that I will ask you a question on this on the exam, and it will be a question about what are the components of the formula. So be familiar with that. As for everything else is a fair game. That's one question right there that we know about. The other two questions will come from something else in that content. NetSuite assignments. So all of these are questions that are very live. If you don't remember any of the questions from NetSuite, go back and take a look at the videos or go back and take a look at the work. I would just be able to answer all these questions in effective detail. 3 questions will come from this and they'll relate to that. Also, I don't think, did I say in there? So make sure you have a general understanding of the revenue and purchasing processes back from chapters 5 and 6. Not as they relate to chapters 5 and 6, but remember how we talked about those in NetSuite because we did the purchasing process first and the revenue process first. So I would expect you to still have the familiarity with that because we did utilize those process areas in our NetSuite analysis. So you should be able to identify the functional areas of those processes or the functional steps in those processes as well. So I think there was a question on that in the practice exam that was similar to that. So that's something that I would expect you to have knowledge of. All right. Any questions? Anything on the study guide that I did not cover that you're concerned about? All right, let's talk about the practice exam. All right. Data analytics professionals estimate they'll spend how much of their time cleaning data in order to perform analysis on it. This one was one that was a large number. It was a very large number. It's not D, unfortunately, or not D, fortunately, I should say. But it is a large number. It's 15 to 90% of their time. Okay, so 50, 90%. Which of the following is not part of the AMPS model? This is a really easy question. Again, I told you for the AMPS model, you need to be able to go more in depth than just this question, but I felt, you know what, let's just have some fun with this question, okay? So ask the question, master the data, perform the analysis, and share the story. Those are the 4 parts of the AMPS model. What is not listed here? Well, parse the data. Hopefully I didn't catch any of you off guard with that one. That still looks like AMPS model, but it's not parse the data, it's perform the analysis. All right. What type of data analysis you use to determine if something will happen in the future? I told you that this was going to be on the exam. It's in the practice exam. These are things you need to know. So let's just go ahead and go through them real quick, okay? Descriptive analysis, what happened? Diagnostic analysis, what will happen? Why did it happen? My apologies. Predictive analysis, what will happen? And prescriptive analysis, what should we do based on what we expect will happen? This one is an easy format of the question because I basically just ask you which one is, and then gave you the definition. So I said, what type of analysis we're using based on what will happen? That's a predictive analysis, okay? There's another question a little bit later on that's more challenging in this area. So you can expect this to be in possible multiple formats if I ask you questions in this area. Which statement best describes data visualization? Okay, so this is actually similar to the homework question that we had. It's very similar in our format. So basically, what are we talking about with data visualization? Remember, I gave my analogy and I said back when I used to teach 221, I had students that would put up the entire financial statements on a slide and expect me to analyze that. I said, that's too much detail. You need to present this visually, all right? So what is that supposed to be doing? You need to actually identify the information that's relevant and present it in a clear form that's contextually available, understandable. Easiest way to do this is use images. Interesting story is I actually had one of our advisory board speakers present to my 930 class, which is Advanced AIS. He was presenting a graph where he was talking about the value of different types of data analytics, okay? And it actually had the 4 types of data analytics that we talked about: descriptive, diagnostic, predictive, and prescriptive. And he showed how as you go up in difficulty, you go up in value of those. It was a visualization of that concept, which I thought, wow, that's a really compelling way of presenting that information. That's an example of a visualization explaining AIS, which is kind of that's like next level thinking right there. But anyway, that's what we're doing. Visualization is presenting information through images that makes it more accessible. Before preparing a visualization in Power BI, I must verify the associations existing between the data using the visualization. What view in Power BI is used for this task? Again, this is the question that I said that I used old terminology, and I apologize for that. I thought I had updated it, and I apparently forgot. So my bad, my bad. But let's just go ahead and make sure we're clear. So first of all, classification, okay? That's not a view, okay? It's not a view, it's one I made up. Data is a view, but we call it table now, okay? Table is the view. Relationships is now called model, and report stays the same. So just as clarification, on the exam, these will not be the terms that I'll use. I will use the new terms, okay? I will use report, model, and table, all right? And you need to make sure you understand the difference between those terminologies. I may talk about the query view, but you don't have to define the query view. That was the 4th view that we did not utilize. I may throw that on there as a possible view, but it would not be a correct answer in any scenario, okay? You already have information now. If you see the word query with respect to Power BI, it is not the correct answer, okay? Not the correct answer. Or maybe if I say which one's not one of the views that we used, never mind, that's going to next level. Okay, so report, that's the visualizations. That's where we did the visualizations themselves. Model, that is where we looked at the relationships between the tables, and we actually defined those relationships based on the keys. And then relationships data, not model. Data is table. Table is where we looked at the tables themselves, and we looked to see how they would look like. We put them into Excel or Access, and we manipulated that information. We could actually add columns. We could actually add fields to that. So which one of these is going to be looking at the associations? That would be the relationships view here, which if I ask you this question on the exam would be called the model view. Okay, relationships model view, or the relationships model view would be the answer there. So again, make sure you have that on the understanding of the new terminology, because like I said, if I ask a question on this, it will use the new terminology. Which of the following is a key benefit of a blockchain system? Okay, so asynchronous updating, okay, that's close. We need to remove the letter A because it's synchronous updating. It's synchronous updating. It's just amazing because we can add one letter and it completely changes the meaning of something. Full transparency of the system, that is definitely a benefit, and that's probably our answer right here, but let's go through the other answers. Single copy of the general ledger, there are actually multiple copies. That's why it's called a distributed ledger, meaning that all of the above cannot be key benefits of the blockchain system. By the way, just as a reminder, all of the above will rarely be the correct answer. I'd say 25% of the time, okay? You see all of the above, you still need to know your stuff, okay? I won't say that I never use it. I will say I use it very sparingly, okay? A quarter of the time on average. Funny how that works out. A company and its key suppliers agree to set up a secure blockchain between them to facilitate purchase and returns transactions. Which of the following types of blockchain to be used in this situation? This is pretty straightforward because we're talking about a group, which if we're talking about a group of companies, that's a consortium, okay? The consortium blockchain by definition. So that's many authorities. Keep in mind, hybrid is one authority with a permissionless process. That's actually a combination of private and public. Private blockchain is one authority, and the public has no central authority, okay? That's the difference between those. A bank has an external list of customer credit scores on hand. The bank uses machine learning techniques to develop its own credit ratings for each customer, which compares the external list. Which type of machine learning is it using? Okay, so it has its own credit scores on hand, so it knows what the credit scores should be, and it's asking the machine learning tool to say, all right, we would like you to develop credit scores on your own, and then they're going to compare the machine learning tool's output to what they have, and they're going to compare those results. So they have a known input and a known output. So by definition, that's considered to be supervised learning, all right, which is an early stage tool. Now, clarification for differences, unsupervised learning is an unknown output. If they did not have credit scores and they asked the machine learning tool to develop it on their own, that would be unsupervised. Semi-supervised is basically they'd be using incomplete data. If it has to make estimations based on information that's not complete, doesn't have all the fields given. And then reinforcement learning, the basic thing you need to know about reinforcement learning is there will always be the term trial and error used, okay? If I define reinforcement learning, I will use those three words, trial and error. That's the idea that it tries to do something one time, and if it's correct, it says, good, I've got that knowledge. If it's incorrect, it will get chastised, it'll get a slap on the hand and say, all right, I made a mistake, I'll correct that mistake in the future. Obviously, it's a analogical slap on the hand. It's more of an idiom than anything else. But anyway, you know, guys, what I'm talking about. Reconciliation of cash accounts may refer to as what type of control? So reconciliations, like a bank reconciliation, what is the goal here? Well, first of all, adjustive controls are not a thing. I throw those on there frequently, but that's not an actual thing. So we have three types: preventive, detective, or preventive. I use preventive this time. All right, preventive, detective, or corrective. So are cash accounts preventive controls? Or sorry, reconciliation of cash accounts preventive controls? No, they don't prevent something from occurring. That's where we say something is actually taking place and we find out about it. We say, hey, that doesn't look right. That sure sounds like a detective control. It's a detective control. So that's our answer here. In a computerized environment, internal controls can be categorized in which of the following. So we're talking about IT controls. Remember, IT controls are general or access controls. Okay, either term is fine. And then application controls. So the general and access controls define what the users can do. Application controls define what the system does. All right, that does not change, but that's just a general identification. So A is our answer. All right, fill in the blank. So blank is or are characterized as the actions, attitudes of the individuals who lead the organization. The tone at the top. What my favorite thing, we're talking about the COSO framework. What's at the very top of the COSO framework? Control environment. Control environment is what's being described here. Okay, control environment. Asymmetric key encryption uses which of the following techniques to allow users to communicate securely? I don't really like this question. This is why it's on a practice exam, but yeah. So what are we talking about with asymmetric key encryption? This actually goes to that diagram. So what is unique about the asymmetric key encryption diagram? Remember that it uses both a public key and a private key, all right? It uses a public key that all receivers have access to, but then a private key to decrypt the information. It's a little bit like the ATM card. You put it in. Everybody's got an ATM card that has access to the same bank, but you have your own unique code that you put in for every single one of those. So that's the answer there, C. All right, fill in the blank. Blank is an information security procedure that utilizes an algorithm to secure that receive file is identical in content to what was sent. This is one of those ones that I told you on one of the slides, just knowing the definition will be sufficient. The definition listed here is hashing, okay? That's all you need to know here is that we're talking about hashing in this situation. All right, Kress's hypothesis. I'm not going to read the whole thing, but I want to read the underlying parts because we talked about this in detail. We looked at three underlying parts. The first of these said having a financial problem which is non-shareable. Okay, so you've got an issue. All right, you've got a problem which is a financial pressure upon you. A financial pressure upon you. So maybe it's going to be that you enjoy sports betting a little bit too much, and so you're in the hole for that. Maybe it is that you got a personal issue. Maybe you've got some sort of pressing medical concern that you're worried that you're not going to have enough money in the future. Whatever it is, you're thinking, all right, I've got this problem. What is that called? Well, I used the word pressure earlier, but another term for it is incentive or pressure. So C, okay? Keep in mind that this Kresge's hypothesis also encompasses two other factors. Opportunity, which basically says you have the chance to commit a fraud, and then the attitude of rationalization. You can actually kind of justify whatever it is that you're doing through some context. Like, I'll never do it again. This is just the one time. Or maybe you will do it again, but you're justified because the person that you're doing it to is a horrible human being. It's a little bit like cheating in the class. It's like, okay, what's my incentive? I really need an A on this exam, all right? What's the opportunity? Dr. Barnes looks at his iPad the entire time, okay? What is the rationalization? Dr. Barnes is kind of a jerk, okay? That's the way to think about it, okay? If you think about it from that context, it should be easy to disseminate each of those concepts. All right, as part of one of the Excel data analytics from chapter 10, we created a pivot table summarizing a set of journal entries to determine why transactions are being entered and approved by the same person. All right, so let's think about what was going on there. That was actually one of our earlier ones. So what was happening is that we identified that somebody was creating the same transaction and also approving that transaction, which shouldn't happen. That's segregation of duties. And we didn't really go into detail, but the original point of it was to be able to determine why this was happening. All right. So this question is, what type of data analytic asks questions? Why did something happen? All right. So this put in a little bit different context of the question we talked about earlier, but it's still the same type of question. Why did something happen? What type of analytic are we employing in there? That's a diagnostic analytic. Okay. So make sure you're looking out for the key terms. If we're talking about descriptive analytic, it's what happened. Those two words should be present in some shape or form. All right. Diagnostic, why did it happen? Prescriptive or predictive analytic, what will happen? Prescriptive analytic, based on what happened, what should we do? It's not going to always be that clear cut, but there will be some interpretation or some variation of that particular context that you should be able to make that distinction. All right. For one of our Excel activities, we briefly explored a newer function in Excel, XLOOKUP. XLOOKUP, what's the following describes one of the differences between VLOOKUP and XLOOKUP. All right, so VLOOKUP requires a specific user to use a specific array or range of cells from the search range, where XLOOKUP uses either arrays or columns in the search range. Is that a correct statement? Is A? That is not a correct statement. We have to transpose those two, because remember, my criticism of XLOOKUP is that you are required to use an array. So XLOOKUP requires you to use an array. VLOOKUP can use either columns or arrays, okay? VLOOKUP can only index based on vertically presented data, where XLOOKUP can look and index based on vertically and horizontally. What do you guys think? Is that a correct statement? That is a correct statement. That is a correct statement about XLOOKUP. That's why XLOOKUP is so much more powerful, is it can do both vertical and horizontal analysis, whereas VLOOKUP is limited to vertical. If you want to do horizontal lookup, you have to do HLOOKUP, okay? VLOOKUP will return only exact matches in your search, whereas XLOOKUP will default to finding approximate matches unless you specify otherwise. Is that a correct statement? That is not a correct statement. Again, I transposed XLOOKUP and VLOOKUP. Remember, we have to put that word false in the VLOOKUPs to make sure we get exact matches. That's one kind of problem with VLOOKUP. If you're not careful, you can come up with approximate matches, which throws things into disarray. So yeah, all I did for A and C is I transposed VLOOKUP and XLOOKUP. B is the only one that correctly describes the relationship with VLOOKUP and XLOOKUP, which means all of the above is not correct again. All right, refer to the following image. All right, so I'm doing a mid function paired with a linked function. Okay, what will be the result of the formula in C1? So let's just go ahead and analyze this. Okay, so at the mid, I'm looking at cell A1. All right, and I'm saying, all right, I want you to go the length of whatever the length of this particular item is here. So it's going to count the number of characters in B. It's going to say 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Then it's going to add a 1 to 6, and it's going to start at 6. It's going to respond to everything that's 10 characters or past. So it's going to say RULES quotation mark, then 3 other characters. The answer is D. It's going to return rules, which is actually the example that we walked through in class. Yes.
What's the component?
What's that?
What's the component that 10 is part of?
So 10 is specifying how far you want to go into to the cell, how many characters you want to return. And since we're returning everything after a certain point, then 10 is just basically an arbitrary number. Remember in class when we talked about, I said put in 50, put in 100. 10 is just going to say that we can actually return everything. So because rules is only 7 characters, 6 characters, can't count. And an accountant, yeah. One of the first tasks we reported in NetSuite as part of the purchasing process to examine what are the defaults in accounting preferences. What was the purpose of this action? I generally don't like memorization tasks of saying, what did we do? Okay, I think this is kind of a cheap question, but this was so important that I feel it's relevant. And plus, you can parse this out based on the nature of the questions themselves, okay? So to ensure that goods are not purchased until after customer orders are approved. Is that what we did? No, and that makes sense, okay? That makes sense. To prevent vendors from submitting invoices prior to delivering orders. Did we do that? Yes, remember, because remember we said bill in advance of receipt, we made sure that that was not checked. That was one of our steps in the purchasing process that we had to walk through. Why did we actually make sure that box was unchecked? Because otherwise vendors could bill us without actually sending us goods. We don't want that happening because then we may accidentally pay them. Prohibit purchasing mail from submitting orders without department approval, that's fine. And avoid payments from being made to vendors who are not creditworthy. Obviously, we want to be able to do that as well. All right. The final step in the purchasing process is to issue payment to the vendor. In NetSuite, which account do we make this payment? Okay. So what would be the cash flow that would come from? It's obviously a cash flow out because we're making a payment to a vendor, so we're eliminating the accounts payable, but we don't have a cash account. What is the account that we actually draw that from? So where would you draw your cash from your bank? Your checking account. So checking is the answer there. That's where we drew it from. Part of the following transaction areas, the NetSuite revenue process, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, what's the correct sequence for transaction areas should be visited during a revenue transaction for goods? I'll be honest, the way I wrote this question is I put the correct sequence together. These are just alphabetical order. Then one of the answers is the correct sequence, and the other one is randomization of the 5 items. Okay, I just used a rand function, which I told you I would use that function. Okay, but I actually used it for the exam. So pretty much for this one, all you have to do is identify what is the very first step, okay? Because I didn't reutilize the steps in the same sequence. So what would be the very first step in the revenue process? Entering a sales order. Again, remember we're talking about from this NetSuite perspective. What do? We entered a sales order, all right? Just for context, moving forward, we have to approve that sales order. That was the step that we had to work through. That was one of those defaults that we set in NetSuite that we had to make sure all sales orders have to be approved, all right? Then after that, fulfill the order. Once the order is fulfilled, we send the invoice out, and then customer sends us money. That's the goal there. So again, all you really need to know is the first step, but I'd expect you to know all 5 steps pretty easily. I don't think this is a particularly difficult question. All right, going on to the problems. 5 V's. All right, what are the 5 V's? So let's just go ahead and go through. Volume, velocity, variety, veracity, value. Okay. So we talked about all those. By the way, the book only mentions 4, but I said you had to know 5, and this is an example of that in this context. All right. So you also need to know what is the adjective to describe each of these. So volume's kind of got it's not a unique adjective, but they use a unique one anyway. So I said high or low, and if you said high, this is fine, but usually they actually used a different word instead of high. What do they say? Huge volume, okay, huge volume. If you said high, I would consider that correct on the exam. Don't fret too much about that. But huge is the term they use. Then they said velocity. Is it a high or low velocity? High velocity, yeah, high velocity. Then variety, this is high or low? High variety. Then we had veracity. What does veracity mean again? It's like accuracy, okay? What do we say about veracity? Is high or low? So it's hard to believe, but not everything that you see on the internet is accurate, okay? It's hard to believe. So veracity is low. And then value was our last one. That's kind of the one that we threw in there. Value of data is at high or low? High, very high. So it can be transformed into valuable information. One of the key steps in data analytics referred to as ETL. What does ETL stand for? You got 1 point for each word if you, this is on the exam. Extract, transform, and load. This is what I kind of affectionately refer to as data cleaning. This is actually our mastering the data step in the AMPS model, okay? This is mastering the data step in the AMPS model. All right, listed below are some examples of different categories of information that might develop as a result of data analytics. For each example, identify which type of visualization would be most appropriate for the type of information presented. Okay, so demographic information, recruitment state students based on classification. So this is categorical data. This is actually the first type of data that we talked about. So it's the first visualization we looked at. What was our first visualization? Those are the bar charts. vertical or horizontal bar charts. If you chose it in bar charts, that would be fine, but vertical or horizontal bar charts. All right. Geographic location of students prior to attending student state. This is geospatial data. This is an easy one. Okay. This is a map or a symbol map. Okay. Percentage of students in each major at Truman State, which is proportional data. So what do you guys think on that one? Pie or a donut chart? Okay. The pie chart, fine. Donut chart, fine. The chart, not fine. It has to be pie or donut chart. Okay. Likely to make everybody hungry right before lunchtime. Yeah. All right. What are the two types of tasks that machine learnings are designed to perform? Provided a brief definition of each type of task. Talked about in the study guide review. This is going to be classification and regression. Okay. Classification and regression. What's the difference? Classification is basically saying it's basically a label, usually a two-tiered label, either one category or a different category, dividing input into output groups. Now, classification can be paired with regression to have multiple categories other than two, but for the most part, classification by itself is usually a two-category system, one or two items. Then regression is basically just trying to determine a value, seeking to predict numbers, okay, seeking to predict real numbers. It's a little bit like regression that you learned in your other classes, your statistics class, or if you've taken Dr. Otero's class. Regression is just trying to determine, based on the inputs, what is the value of an output. All right, what are the three information technology IT governance frameworks we examined in this course? Briefly define the role of each framework. So we have COVID. By the way, if I asked you a question like this on the exam, you do not need to know the detailed names of each. You don't have to tell me what COVID stands for, which means control objectives for information and related technologies. You don't have to tell me that. You just can tell me it's COVID and that's fine, okay? I'm not trying to disseminate too much, but you will need to tell me that COVID focuses IT governance and management. It's a very high level framework. It's about trying to generate organizational value and making sure that the operations organizations are well defined, okay? Then we have information technology infrastructure library, which is ITIL, which if you gave me ITIL, that would be fine too. But ITIL is about IT service management, okay? Specifically providing IT services and establishing the scope of IT service management, okay? The final one is the International Organization for Standardization 27,000 series, or ISO 27,000 series. By the way, you may say, iOS, you said International Organization for Standardization, shouldn't be iOS, Dr. Barnes? The answer is if we were operating in English language, yes, but this is actually a European organization. I believe they operate in French as their native language, which means that ISO is how it would be said in French. That's at least my understanding, okay? So it's ISO 27,000 series. ISO 27,000 series is about information security. Specifically, it's about how to develop and maintain an information security management system, ISMS. Last thing to talk about, okay? Three data characteristics that information security is designed to ensure. So all three characteristics have to be maintained for information security to be maintained. What are those? And I gave you a hint on this one. It's the blank, blank, blank triad, okay? Which if you hopefully you remembered my stupid joke in the slides where I said it sounds like a governmental agency working with a crime agency. It's the CIA triad: confidentiality, integrity, and availability. That's all you had to put on this particular question. All right, questions on the exam? Any questions that I went through too quickly you need an answer for or need some clarification on? All right, as always, I recommend that you show up early on Monday because I will probably start the exam a little bit early so that everybody has plenty of time. I do not think that will be an issue, but I will give you as much time as possible to work through the exam if that's the case. If you have questions about the exam over the weekend, if they are short questions, you are welcome to email them to me. If you decide to type up a page and a half of questions that will take me an hour and a half to email, I may say, can we set up a Zoom call? I'm happy to do that on a weekend. I have no life. All right. Have a good weekend.